There we go.
This is Karen with newclevelandradio.net. It is time for Take Two.
I'm glad you could join us on Take Two today. This is Betsy Broadman, and today we have a special guest who is a remarkable woman. It's Lesley Kane, who lives in New Orleans, and she was born and raised, and Lesley, correct me if I'm wrong, I think it's sort of the mid-south part of Memphis, is that right?
That is correct. My father worked for a major department store, and we bopped all around the rural South, usually living in the armpit of most southern states, mostly up and down the Mississippi River.
Amazing. How did you get to New York City?
I went to New York City to live there because I had married a native New Yorker who I met while living in New Orleans.
Okay, but you were living in New Orleans before that.
That's correct. I had moved to New Orleans from Memphis in 1996 after visiting for nearly every weekend for 6 months in 1995. And I remember, just falling in love with the city. It was unlike any place I had ever been before. And, 25 plus years later, I look back on not remembering when I met many of my friends, but I can't remember not knowing them. And that's a beautiful thing.
That's really important. I think also what's really nice about what I do know about you is that when you moved down, you had 2 girls.
Yes.
Who are now how old?
They are now 17 and almost 15. And, when my husband and I got married, we were living in the French Quarter, not thinking about kids. The French Quarter, while there's a school in the French Quarter, it's a neighborhood, and there are kids. I know families who have, raised their children in the French Quarter. But when we moved back to New Orleans after living in New York for several years, came back with a 3-year-old and a 1-year-old, didn't really make sense. There's not a lot of, there's not a backyard, and so we decided to live in the Uptown area, not far from the universities. Actually, Tulane and Loyola are right next door to one another, and we're not far from the university neighborhood.
So when you moved down there, how was the transition from Manhattan down to New Orleans?
Well, I would first say that living in Manhattan in the apartment the size of a cocktail napkin, definitely our square footage increased a bit. The rents aren't necessarily cheaper here, but you do get a little more square footage for what you get. And, and coming back here, we just made them do what we love doing. We would take them down to the French Quarter every weekend and listen to music and take them to our favorite pastry shop or our candy shop and hearing live music. And, my husband taught them early how to tip, put money in the tip jar or in the guitar case or whatever the hat is, whatever the musicians on Royal Street that are playing. And I remember specifically one musician, after one of my little girls, who might have been 2 or 3, put a $5 bill or whatever in the guitar case. One of the musicians said, "See, tipping is so easy, even a child could do it."
It sounds organic. It sounds almost like it was an easy, organic move culturally, though it must have been a little bit of a shock.
Having lived in New York, when we moved to New York, after visiting there because we had been married for nearly 5 years and we were living in the French Quarter. And so we always went to New York, 2 or 3 times a year anyway. And then
Okay.
once we decided to move to New York in 2003, we were walking around and thinking, do we really live here? There was this out of body experience, and I'm sure you've
Right.
experienced that. It was a city that we were, already familiar with. He was a native New Yorker, and and then living there after visiting, often, there was this out of body experience. Do we really live here? And then when we moved back, it was a different out of body experience. Did we really move back to New Orleans? Are we really here raising our kids and dragging them to Jazz Fest and making them do whatever it is that, we just figured they would acclimate to our way of living. And for the most part, that has worked.
I think too, what I was just, as you're talking, what I was thinking is that New York is such a amalgamation of people, such a incredible full pot of different kinds of people, but New Orleans is such the same, no?
It is also this fascinating amalgam. You've got it's an incredibly immigrant city. There are definitely similarities between New York, and not just Manhattan, but New York, and New Orleans. But I would say what makes it different, and even when people come here and visit, they automatically say, what is it that is so different about this city? And I really think, going to the colonial part of the history of New Orleans, just starting with that, even though, of course, like New York and other places, there were indigenous tribes here, but, going to the colonial side, this was not founded by the Plymouth Rock set. This was a Catholic French colony, and then it was a Spanish Catholic colony, or it was a French Catholic colony for 60 years, a Spanish Catholic colony for nearly 40 years, until Napoleon decided he wanted this back when he took power. But, during that, colonial time period, pre-Louisiana Purchase, there, was this mix of, during the Spanish time period, free people of color were permitted to live here.
Wow.
We're considered the northernmost Caribbean city. You've got the
Wait, can you say that again?
many people consider, I can't remember,
The northernmost Caribbean city?
northernmost Caribbean city.
Wow.
And I don't know. Somebody can Google that. I've yet to Google.
No, I'm just saying that I get it, but I think that's
Yeah.
fascinating.
Yes, things I've yet to Google, but that's the word on the street.
I didn't mean factually. I just meant the concept was wonderful.
Yes. So, it is. And, and so there's this, fascinating mix of Catholic immigrants who came here, because pre-Louisiana Purchase, you couldn't be Protestant.
Mhm.
You could not be Jewish. And when the enslaved came here, shortly after the French decided this was going to be the capital of the Louisiana Territory,
Right.
you got 2,000 enslaved who were brought here, against their will, and they were required to be baptized Catholic. There was enforced baptism. So the majority of baptisms that took place in, what is now St. Louis Cathedral, in the church, were the enslaved who were brought here. So, voodoo was practiced under the radar, and there still is a large, Black Catholic community in New Orleans. And, then Louisiana Purchase, fast forward.
Can I just stop you for a
Sure,
second?
Absolutely.
So that really perked something, because I've been there a few times, but I've only been there with professional meetings. I've never really been there just sort of walking around, doing my
Absorbing.
thing.
Uh,
Yeah. So when we were there for dinners at these really nice restaurants, I would go in another room, and I would talk to a waitress, and she'd say, do you know about the voodoo readings that are taking place at this place? Because I would ask her about some unusual things. So is that still going on?
The voodoo.
Yeah.
Yes. And I would say too, because this was a Catholic colony, there is the Voodoo Museum in the French Quarter. There are a couple of voodoo shops in New Orleans in the French Quarter, but voodoo in New Orleans is different than voodoo in other places, because was this infusion with the Catholicism. So say someone like Marie Laveau, who was our voodoo priestess, who I would say, really had such a cult following that when she died in the late 1880s, I believe, her obituary was in the New York Times. She made the New York Times obituary when she died. But, someone like Marie Laveau, who was a voodoo priestess, is also buried in a Catholic cemetery. One of her one of her grandmother's ancestors who had come, as an enslaved person, had been baptized Catholic. So, her family would have been Catholic. And that's the amazing thing about, like, say, the Archdiocese. They keep impeccable records. They have records of her birth certificate, her baptism certificate, her marriage certificate, and her death certificate. So even though she practiced voodoo, she would begin and end her voodoo rituals with a Catholic prayer. She practiced those 7 acts of mercies. I'm not Catholic, but when you live in a very Catholic city, you embrace the culture and you learn an awful lot about it. And, she was going into prisons and building altars, for prisoners awaiting execution, and going onto the battlefields and, caring for the wounded soldiers. So those 7 acts of mercies that, the benevolence that is a part of that Catholic culture, she was a part of that as well. So I've had people ask, how can a voodoo priestess be buried in a Catholic cemetery? I'm like, well, she was a devout Catholic. She went to mass regularly.
Mm-hmm.
So, voodoo here in New Orleans is a little different than, in Haiti or other places, or even in Manhattan, where there's voodoo in Manhattan.
So I'm just thinking about what you're saying. So it's not just voodoo that's really unique, very, very unique to that part of Louisiana.
Yes.
I mean, there's so many other things that really lures you in and really takes your heart in New Orleans. It's obviously the music, but there's something in the air, there's something in the water, there's something about it.
It is. And it's one of those kind of places that once it gets into your bloodstream, it can be really difficult to want to live anywhere else. And I can't really put my finger on it, but, again, going back to it being an immigrant city, where Manhattan, has, a multitude of immigrants coming from all over the place. This was incredibly Catholic. So we have one of the largest Sicilian populations outside of Sicily.
Really?
Still today, one of the largest Honduran populations, Croatian, and of course, the Vietnamese culture. In the 70s, the Vietnamese came here because that was a French colony. And, our climate is, very similar and marshy. And so, we have some really good Vietnamese, restaurants, and there's Vietnamese culture here. And, even going back to, pre-Louisiana Purchase, I mean, think about the music. I mean, Bach was like, he was the rock star of music during, say 1718 or whatever. And, but in New Orleans, you have a mix of, your French society, and then you have enslaved, and then there's the drumming and the rhythms, and then you have different cultures coming in, and German, Irish, Portuguese. There's just an incredible amount of immigrants, and most of them have Catholic heritage.
And in a lot of cities that are rich, that rich tapestry of immigrants living together and settling in various parts of a city, there's almost a breaking point at points where that something happens, different things happen. Do you have any examples of that? I can give you examples here in Boston and New York and a lot of other places. So anything?
Well, I would say, I guess, a distinct breaking point, if I'm understanding correctly, would be the Louisiana Purchase, because prior to the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, this was, a European colony, and the French never even wanted to be Spanish. They certainly didn't want to be American, but
well, French.
and quarter, and it was really the Americans who started calling, what is considered the French Quarter now. They called it the French Quarter. So I would say that that particular divide really happened at the Louisiana Purchase, because prior to that, you've got 6x12 blocks, which is encompassing the French Quarter. And, just this, mix, and interracial marriages were not legal, but, laws or suggestions in New Orleans, and have always been laws or suggestions here. But, there have been these common law marriages. There's a lot of intertwining, intermingling, lots of, races, living in close proximity to one another. Stuffy Protestants come here after the Louisiana Purchase. And I say that as someone who's a Protestant from Arkansas, from the rural South. We have to joke about that, because the American set started coming here, and it was a major culture clash. So, that divide really is Canal Street. That divide is Canal Street. And if you've spent some time in New Orleans, and you have, Betsy, St. Charles Avenue on the other side of Canal Street is Royal Street in the French Quarter. Decatur Street in the French Quarter becomes Magazine Street.
Right.
Carondelet, who was one of our first, Spanish governors during the Spanish time period. But that was the town of Lafayette. The Americans could not use the New Orleans street names. The French Quarter, as we know it, that was New Orleans. So anything above Canal Street, which of course the canal never did happen. But, that was what we call the neutral ground. Everybody else calls a median. We call it a neutral ground. There would be transactions, business transactions. We're going to meet on Canal Street. That's a neutral ground. American side's going to meet with the French side, or, and deal with their business dealings. And so that is really where the Americans started building. And then eventually the Garden District was developed as a little suburb, and it was the town of Lafayette, but eventually annexed into New Orleans.
So thank you. So when you have requests for tours, or someone calls you about a tour, how does this all start? Like I know that you give private tours, right? Is that right? Yeah. How do you go about that? How does that start?
A lot of it has been word of mouth. Somebody might, have a brother or a sister or a cousin who's coming to town, and we would like to take a tour with you. And, if they've never been here, I always suggest doing the French Quarter first, because that is the heart and soul of the city. That's the reason that the city is here, of course, is the Mississippi River. That's the whole reason the city is here, is because of its proximity to the mouth of the Mississippi River, the Gulf Coast. And, it's the spine of our country, that they needed this major artery for
right.
Yes. So, I tell people, if they've never been here before, let's start in the French Quarter. I had two guys on a private tour yesterday from Philadelphia. They flew in on Mardi Gras Day. They'd never been here before. And they helped us walk out for an hour, and they were out for 11 hours. And they had a blast. And then we did a tour on Ash Wednesday, and they could still feel the energy. But, they had never been here before, so they didn't know that there's this deep connection between Philadelphia and New Orleans. Our ironwork.
That's amazing to me. Wow.
Yeah. A lot of the ironwork all came from the same catalog. Some of Ohio too, but the fired bricks from Philadelphia. You didn't want our Mississippi clay mud bricks, explode.
Well, they don't hold well together. So
they don't hold well together.
They don't.
And also, Benjamin Latrobe, even though he was British, he immigrated to Philadelphia, and he designed the waterworks system. And somehow New Orleans got it after Philadelphia before New York. They were third. And, so he was also an engineer as well as an architect. And sadly, he died here of yellow fever, and his son as well. Which is really sad, because they developed this clean waterworks system. But it was prior to 1900, when Walter Reed was the one who firmly established that yellow fever is a mosquito-borne virus. And, there's standing water everywhere. You've got cisterns, water fountains, and they died of yellow fever, not knowing that it was that it was a mosquito-borne virus, not contagious.
Can I just ask you one thing? Can I get back? So, before, when you're talking to people about their tour, and what sorts of things do you ask them about what they may want to see? Or how do you get information about them? Or do you? I mean, I don't really know the process.
I do. And especially, and I work for other companies too, but, I also, work on my own also. But usually, I, by their cell phone number or their area code, oh, you're from Oregon or whatever. And there's usually some sort of story. I do feel like all roads lead to or from New Orleans eventually, but it's their tour. It's their tour.
Right.
I have, 5 high school girlfriends coming in next month, and they really want to know about the brothels and the bordellos and the sort of bawdier, seedier side of New Orleans. And there's a lot of that. And, sometimes, they might be more interested in voodoo, or, if I have kids on the tour, they want to know more about the ghosts. And, so I asked them.
Can you tell me a little bit about that? Because I had talked to you about coming in and going to, what was the name of that famous restaurant? Captain's
Palace. Was that it? Commander's Palace? Was
yes.
that the one you went to?
Yeah. And then upstairs supposedly was a very famous brothel. And the waitress took me around upstairs. It was a winding staircase, I think. And we went up towards the top, and she showed me the room you can't go in. And I said, why can't you go in there? And she said, well, it's empty, but we still hear noises from that. And she really believed that. She wasn't just saying that because I was a tourist.
Mm-hmm. She had felt something. And
they all had, yeah.
Yeah, I have not seen ghosts at Commander's Palace. And there are some stories that are realm of legend. That's the term that many tour guides use, realm of legend, because it makes for a good story, but it also, may not be legally on the books or whatever. But as far as upstairs with Commander's Palace, I don't know that it was actually ever a brothel, but there are still pocket doors for private dining. And, that became a restaurant in 1893. But then upstairs, after World War I broke out, Storyville, the red light district where the brothels, were, where all the action was going on, shut down. It's a government shutdown because legally you can't have a vice district within 5 miles of a military base. It's what we would call a domestic invasion. It was going to be a bit of a distraction for those soldiers. Light district there. And, but that did not end prostitution. It just dispersed throughout the city. And some people say that, well, upstairs, there's the private dining, and there is still a side entrance where, gentlemen would bring their lady friends to, upstairs, because there's the main entrance where, almost like Sopranos, you dine with your family on Friday, but your lady friend, on Saturday or whatever. And I'm just using that as a more recent example. But upstairs there would be pocket doors, and maybe while you're waiting for dinner, private dining took place.
Really.
But I do believe those pocket doors are still there. It's been a while since I've been.
No, they are. Yeah.
Years since I've been upstairs, but yes. But as far as ghosts, I mean, I was the singing cocktail waitress for several years at Lafitte's blacksmith shop, and that is one of the oldest buildings used as a bar in the United States. It's not the oldest bar, but it's the oldest building, and it's like, it survived 2 fires in the French Quarter. And I have definitely felt the hair on the back of my neck tingle. I have heard voices. There might have been, after closing time, the owner is upstairs, counting money and putting it in the safe, and the bartender's up there, counting with him. And I'm the only person on the floor sweeping or doing whatever it is that I'm doing to tidy up before we leave. And I heard somebody saying, Lesley, calling my name and asking me a question. And then I heard him coming downstairs, my boss, but the sound came from where the piano bar is, and it was completely, and I said, wait, weren't you over here? And he said, no, I was just upstairs. And, and so that, it doesn't scare me, but I certainly believe
that. It's fascinating.
Yeah. I mean, I've known couples who have lived in a haunted house, and, finally had to say, hey, I have to tell you, there's a ghost girl, and she's hanging out on the steps, and she's terrorizing me. She's like, oh my God, I have been afraid to tell you, but she's been, hanging out on the stairs and running away from me. And, so you hear those stories.
Did I
And
tell you the story about the mechanics that we had when we lived in Cambridge? When we
No.
had that huge car? We had my father, Denny and I had just moved to Cambridge and we didn't have money. And so we decided to say, well, get us a car under $300, $400, whatever. And he got us a boat, a big Le Mans Pontiac, but it was a boat, literally. It was huge. And it, excuse me one second, I'm just going to take this off the hook. And it held, the first and the second seat, and then it had the third seat in the back. And so we used it for a lot of things, and it quickly got more miles and more miles on it. And we had it fixed at the gas station around the corner. And the two mechanics that worked there were brothers from Louisiana and Arkansas. They were sharecroppers. They were Black sharecroppers, and they were lovely, lovely people, really smart and brilliant at their work. I came in one day because, oh my gosh, we had at the bottom of the gas tank was a big old hole and the gas was pouring out. And that was a big job. We didn't have the money. Long story short, Cliff decided that he needed to go get some Ivory soap. He said, I'll be right back. I'm going to go get Ivory soap. I said, for what? He said, watch me now. So he comes back with this whole bunch of Ivory soap and he wets it and he puts it right where the hole is. And he said, come back in about 2 hours and it'll be all done. And what he had learned on the farm with the old tractors, with their rusty parts, is that you could use that and they would adhere to the rusty metal. And I tell you, we must have had that car for 3 years and we never had a problem ever again.
That's incredible.
But so that leads to the story about they grew up in New Orleans. They were actually born and bred in Louisiana and New Orleans. They moved to when I think one was in, what would they call it? Elementary school. I don't know what it's called there. They were in like very heavy duty Catholic parish. One day when Cliff was a little boy, something woke him up in the middle of the night and he sat up and he saw something that was an apparition, but he absolutely saw something that was very, very special about this. And he didn't know what to do. So he pulled the covers over his head and he didn't tell his brother. And he tried to go back to sleep. Nothing was ever said. And something like 15, 16 years later, they were at a family picnic and his brother said, I remember one night when I was trying to go to sleep and I woke up, and he described the apparition exactly the same way that Cliff had seen it. So they had ghosts in that farmhouse down in New Orleans. Incredible.
Well, it is known to have ghosts, and it does not shock me to hear those stories, and it doesn't disturb me at all. If anything, I feel like, hey, I'm living here after they have lived here and just embracing it. Right. If that makes sense. Just embracing the city, embracing all that it has to offer, ghosts and all.
Yeah. What are some of the most surprising, I guess I would call it surprising, or whatever you want to call it, fun, surprising, unique, things that have happened when you've taken people on tours? Unexpected.
Well, those things happen a lot just because, I find out from my guests, what it is. If they're specifically interested in something, we will definitely go there. But most people, they don't know anything about New Orleans. And so, they're just following my lead. But a few months ago, I did a private tour. There were these two wonderful guys from Mexico City. Didn't know anything about them. They had never been here before. But when they told me they were from Mexico City, I said, New Orleans has, deep roots with Mexico. And I said, Benito Juarez was rolling cigars in a factory before he, was ever president, and he lived here for a while, and they
Wow.
didn't realize that. And I said, there's a statue over on Basin Street near St. Louis Cemetery #1. We'll make our way over there. And so we're walking around, and the French Quarter is still residential. There's, it gets a lot of tourists, but many people live in the French Quarter. There's still, hopefully, will remain an elementary school there as well. It is a neighborhood. But walking around, because there are apartments and homes there, many people have their saints, maybe Our Lady of Guadalupe. And one of the gentlemen on the tour was taken aback. He was startled and noticed, he said, there's Guadalupe. And I said, yeah. I said, many people will have, we don't really have front yards in the French Quarter, so their statue might be in the window, or they might have one in their courtyard. But he kept noticing a number of homes, with, Guadalupe in the window. And his partner said to me, quietly, says, oh, he writes extensively about saints, in particular, Our Lady of Guadalupe. And so I thought, well, that's interesting. And right across the street from the Benito Juarez statue is the Chapel of Our Lady of Guadalupe, which also has a lovely little grotto on the side. And I didn't tell them this, but that's where we ended the tour. And also, as we were walking around, I used to live in the quarter. And so sometimes I run into people that I know, and that's fun, and I'll introduce them. And maybe there's a little anecdote about, something, and somehow the film industry came up because a story about my bed, spending the night with Brad and Angelina's house one night, that's a whole other story. But during this particular moment, they find out that these two guys are in the film industry. They're in the film industry. And so, and that this guy is like one of the greatest screenwriters in Mexico City. And, so it's really fabulous. And he's written about, Guadalupe. And so it was a 3-hour tour. So we covered a lot of ground, but we did end up right at noon at the chapel when Mass started. And he, was really thrilled. He was just incredibly thrilled, stepped inside to partake a little bit of, to absorb a bit of the Mass. And then we went to the grotto, and you could buy candles next door and light a candle for loved ones. And that was incredibly bad. And also too, we went to the Benito Juarez statue just before the chapel. And, they were taking tons of photos. They were, hugging their hearts, and they were incredibly thrilled to know that there was this history that they were completely not aware of. So those are little things that happen. That was one of my favorite tours, actually, to share that with them. And I do try to find, ways, even if it's just 30 seconds, if there's a little connection, because if you're up and down the Mississippi River, there's the 7 Years' War. Somehow, you either ended up on the British side of the river or the French side of the river. And there's always some sort of connection. I had some folks from Ohio. I can't remember if it was Ohio. I can't remember, but they were visiting, and I said, well, welcome home. You originally were part of the Louisiana Territory. Welcome back,
Oh my goodness. Have you read many books that sort of, what's the word? Give you ideas of things that you're going to do during one of your tours, or a part, like, or sort of a jumping off point for some tours you want to do?
Yes, all I do is read. In fact, we're not on video, but I am looking at about 10 books that I pulled to put on my table here, just because I'm constantly reading. And when the pandemic started, of course, quarantine happened and the tours just shut down. So, my last tour was a private tour with a group of au pairs. And that was March, Friday the 13th. And then my next tour wasn't until Halloween night. So those were my bookends, Friday the 13th and Halloween, until my last tour, and then my next tour during the pandemic. And I just started reading even more so. It's not like I don't already have 50 books on New Orleans, but when the pandemic started, I called my local bookstore and said, what do you have on the Decameron Tales? Let's go way back. Let's take,
what is it called? What is
the Decameron Tales, which, is set in Italy and during the Black Plague. And, I did not pull that and put that on my on my table here, but I wanted to go back to the history of pandemics and epidemics and, how are people dealing with that? And of course, medical advances did not, were not what they are today. And
Mhm.
yeah, and so, that is really fascinating, to me to just, take it far back. And even, yellow fever, as a tour guide talking about yellow fever, it really put things in perspective. And, just I started reading about yellow fever prior to Walter Reed firmly establishing that it was, a mosquito-borne virus. But even in the late 1800s, like even in the 1890s, there was another outbreak in New Orleans of yellow fever. And human nature does not change very much. The
Sure.
epidemic was big here in New Orleans, and anybody that was on a train headed to, say, Jackson, Mississippi, or Memphis, Tennessee, or St. Louis, there were people at the train station with their shotguns at the door of the train car. Anybody from New Orleans gets off this train, we're going to shoot you, because they were terrified. They didn't know that it was not, that they thought that yellow fever was contagious. And you think about that during the pandemic. Hey, Texas, our numbers are looking good. Don't come here. And so, there was, in
Well,
the
it's
early,
terrifying. It really is.
It is. And so, but it's fascinating to me that, that human nature, we don't want you coming here spreading your virus, your cooties. And, and so that was fascinating. I did a lot of reading during the pandemic, but, I would say, one of my favorite writers is Richard Campanella, and he wrote several books. One of them is Bienville's Dilemma, who Bienville was one of the brothers, Bienville and Iberville, who, came and pretty much established this as Louisiana territory for the King of France. But Richard Campanella is a Tulane professor. And I would say anything that he writes, whether it is a blog, whether it is a newspaper article or a book, it is well worth your time. He, has written the history of Bourbon Street, and he's written a book on pretty much just the historical geography of New Orleans. He's written a number of things. And, I quote him all the time, and grateful for him, because I'm not a historian. I just absorb all of the New Orleans culture. And, he's one in particular. There's also a wonderful writer who lives in DC. Her name is Carolyn Morrow Long. She wrote a book on Marie Laveau. And, she was able to get into, some of like the Archdiocese archives and find out how many people are buried in her tomb, which has 3 vaults, and, find out the names of everybody who was in there. And, and just a lot of history.
Seriously? That's amazing.
Just really fascinating.
It
And,
is. I'm getting into genealogy, so I understand what that
Yeah.
takes. Yeah.
Yeah. So there's no shortage of history to, I mean, there's always something more to learn. And I learned from my guest on my tour. I was on a tour. I was in front of one of Anne Rice's homes a few months ago, and this couple from Ohio, he noticed, these beautiful Pennsylvania bluestones, and I didn't know that's what they were called, but he worked in the rock business, and so
Yeah.
learned something new. And I love it when my guests ask questions, because if I don't know the answer, I'm going to go home and I'm going to do my Nancy Drew super sleuthing, and I'm going to find it, and I'm going to text you, and I'm going to give you the answer. And then it helps me, There's never, there's always more to learn, always more to learn.
I think, well, absolutely. And to be curious is one of the best things about growing older. Just keep being curious about more and more and more, and never shut that down. In fact, opening that up is really special, I think. Don't you?
Absolutely. It's funny, in school, you can't wait to get out of school. And then
Right.
if
Exactly.
you're fortunate and you get bitten by, the love of reading, that's, just, it makes it all come to life. And it keeps your mind fresh. And it helps you realize, when I was 25, I thought I knew everything. And now I'm in my 50s, and boy, I don't know anything. I'm still, learning. And it's humbling and it's beautiful.
So when you are questioning people, let's say you didn't know me and someone referred me to you, what sorts of questions would you ask me before you took me on a quote unquote personalized tour?
I would ask if you had ever been to New Orleans.
And I hadn't.
And if you have been, when was the last time you were here? Somebody may have not been here since, prior to Hurricane Katrina, and the city has changed tremendously since then.
And you can still, and I think the thing that's really astounding, I don't know if you bring people in the parish, but you can, and that you can still see the watermark, which really upsets me.
Absolutely.
Water level was, it really upsets me.
Yes. Yes, that's true. I do cemetery. I do work for a nonprofit called Save Our Cemeteries. And I used to work for a community foundation. And so I still have to keep my foot in nonprofit. And so I, a couple of times a month do tours for Save Our Cemeteries, which is the only nonprofit that offers tours in cemeteries, and your ticket price goes towards the renovation and restoration of those tombs. And we have over 40 cemeteries in New Orleans, but there's St. Roch Cemetery, which was hard hit. It's just, it's downriver from the French Quarter, not far. It's in between the river and the lake, St. Roch neighborhood.
Okay, I know what you're talking about.
Yeah, it was underwater, and they have a little side. They have a chapel, but on the side of the chapel is a little room where they have ex votos, like little votives and offerings, plastered legs, plastered hearts, and there is still a water line where on the heart, it was devastating how much water St. Roch Cemetery got. And that's a very working class neighborhood. It's not the sexiest cemetery. It's probably the least visited cemetery in the city, but it has my heart and soul. It was, founded by a German priest.
What parish would that be?
It's in Orleans Parish. It's in New Orleans, but it's not as far down as the Ninth Ward. The Ninth Ward is on the other side of the canal, a little further down river. But St. Roch neighborhood is not as close to the river as, say, the French Quarter or the Marigny, which is below the quarter, and then Bywater is just below Marigny. But then St. Roch is on the other side of what would be Rampart Street on the edge of the French Quarter, becomes St. Claude Avenue. And it's, a little close. It's not closer to the lake, but it's on the lake side of this main street on St. Claude. So it was really hard hit with hurricane or the levees breaching. But yeah, I mean, there's a red heart that's in this side chapel that you could see the water line on it.
It was so sad. What were you doing at that time?
I was actually living on the Upper East Side with a 5-month-old, and but my father-in-law was here. Both he and my husband, were native New Yorkers, right? But we somehow managed to be living in the French Quarter on 9/11 and living on the Upper East Side during Hurricane Katrina. But my father-in-law was here, and I don't know how we missed those two devastating events, not living in our two beloved cities. It was very difficult because my father-in-law was here, and he was fortunate to not have any flooding, but he was a senior citizen. He was a heart patient, and he wasn't coming back until his cardiologist was back in town. He needed his network, and his cardiologist had lost everything. His house flooded, was damaged. Oh. And so he, was in Starkville, Mississippi for about 6 weeks. Didn't look like his power was coming back on. His doctor wasn't back in town. So he came up to New York with his German Shepherd and pretty much the clothes on his back. And he stayed at a hotel. FEMA was, somehow managed to get, his hotel covered by FEMA. And he was there for 6 weeks until his doctor was back in town. His power came back on. And so he was fortunate that, he lived a little closer to the river up near the universities, and that area did not flood. I got a little bit of water like on his front porch, but did not get into the house. And, that's that's a positive story, because there are so many people who just lost everything. And that's an incredible thing, Betsy, too, is when Kevin and I first came back to New Orleans for the first time after Hurricane Katrina, it was Ash Wednesday, 2006. We came back with a 13-month-old. We flew in on Ash Wednesday, and thankfully we had a babysitter. My father-in-law was here, and he could watch the baby while we went out and enjoyed music and had music and dinner. And one of the things that we noticed was the food had never tasted better. The food was incredible. The music was incredible. And many of these musicians and many of these chefs and restaurant workers had lost everything. But there's just, and I may start crying, but there's something about that human spirit that is indefatigable, if I'm saying that correctly, that was ever present. And, by God, we're coming back, we're going to make it. And it was ever present. And I will never forget that. People who had lost everything were, singing their hearts out, playing their hearts out, cooking their hearts out, and giving
because
back.
they paid so much to help everyone else. I mean, people were really, trying to help everyone else. I mean, we were down there then, and it was on one hand incredibly devastating. We were down there for relief efforts. On the other hand, it was from a pulled back point of view, I guess, not living there, obviously. It was very heartwarming to watch all these people come in from all over to just do anything they could.
Yeah. New Orleans lives in your heart no matter where you are.
It does.
Mardi Gras just ended. Yesterday was Ash Wednesday. Tuesday was Mardi Gras Day, Fat Tuesday. And many people were apprehensive about going out there. I went out during the day for exactly an hour with a mask on, and just wanted to be a part of the energy. And I really needed to feel that energy, but some people weren't feeling it, and they just, stayed home. And, I feel like Mardi Gras is one of, it's something that allows you to heal, breathe, move forward, in whatever way you see fit. And also, embracing all that we've been given to love, all that we've lost, and all that we've been given to enjoy. And it was a beautiful day. And, some people decided to stay home. Some people decided to just walk by the river. And, it was an incredible, energetic, revitalizing kind of day.
Mm-hmm.
But that being said, and you're talking about people coming to New Orleans and helping out after after Hurricane Katrina, this is a very Catholic city, as I said, and there's a lot of benevolence behind the city, and people in the city take care of their own too. And Mardi Gras, there are the parades. But if you're on a float, these are not government funded parades. I've had people on my tours from Brazil, and they're shocked that it's not a government funded parade. These are funded through the individual crews or little clubs. And, if you're on a float, you're paying your membership dues to be on the float. You're also buying all your throws, your tchotchkes, that you're handing out to the parade goers. And that's, you're on the float for 4 hours. That's a lot of swag. And that costs a lot of money out of your own pocket. This is not government funded. These are people buying their own throws and throwing it to, for the good of just the spirit of carnival. And, but that also being said, there's the crew of Zulu, which, Louis Armstrong was the king of Zulu as well. And, those started out as social aid and pleasure clubs. And those, were the clubs that, making sure that they're sort of like your Teamsters. make it was like your little insurance. Somebody would come by and collect your 5-10 cents a week. You're a part of your little Croatian or firefighters, butchers, and there's the Italian Benevolent Society too, which Easy Rider, that's where, Peter Fonda is, having his psychedelic moment. Italian Benevolent Society too. And, that was to ensure that if you, your mother, your brother, somebody in your family died, they were going to be given a proper burial. And also, if somebody was sick and they needed, their meds, they are going to give you a slip to go to what is now the Pharmacy Museum, which, by the way, is the best $10 you'll spend in the city. It's in the French Quarter. It's a wonderful museum. But, that was the first pharmacy and I believe in the country. And, that was, you were given a slip to go and get your medicine. It was your little benevolent society. But if you're in one of the fancier crews, you're paying your dues. But these crews also have funds at the foundation where I worked, and they're giving back to women's shelters, children's, to education, arts. Mm-hmm. So it's partying with a purpose, but you're not going to see that on the evening news. They're not going to tell you all this benevolence behind the society, the cruise and the parades. They're not going to show you that on the evening news, but that's something that I like sharing with people.
Well, Lesley, this has been a very, very enriching, really, incredibly enriching. Speaking of a very enriching talk today. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I hope you'll come back because there's so much more to talk about.
There's always more to talk about. And I'm a Southerner. That's one of the reasons I decided to become a tour guide is, I just thought I'd, turn that flaw into an asset. I love to talk. I love to tell stories.
Well, thank you so much for coming today.
Thank you, Betsy.
Well, take
Such
care.
an honor.